It does raise an interesting question with Kosovo, though. It's I was reading in the New York Review of Books the poet laureate of the United States is a Serbian immigrant, Charles Simic, and he said that the illegality of the declaration of independence of Kosovo was hard to justify. His argument is that it is in violation of the UN, the basic foundation of the UN, that there was no sort of mutual agreement that Kosovo would split. And I've been thinking a lot about that. Then this last week we brought in an author who wrote about Kurdistan, and there seems to be a sort of sense that the northern parts of Iraq could separate under the right circumstances. But how would you have felt about, obviously it is speculative, but how would you have felt if these seemingly positive changes in a lot of ways would have come at the expense of the global body itself, of an organization like the UN?
Well, I think he would have been very conflicted, as he was, about the intervention in Kosovo to begin with, which, foreshadowing Simic's point, itself was arguably illegal. I mean, what NATO did in 1999, I have to say, an intervention that I supported, and I thought that all other routes to a peaceful settlement of the Kosovo problem had been exhausted, and that Milosevic was in the midst of doing something very dastardly that would mirror what he had done in Bosnia just 4 years before, like the massacre in Srebrenica and so forth. Now, we'll never know what Milosevic would have done. All we'll know is the harm caused by the NATO bombing, and also the atrocities that the NATO bombing unleashed on the part of Milosevic and his forces. So here again, we run into this problem of politics. We only know the harms that are committed, not the harms that have been prevented. But I think that what happened then, back in '99, was you had a standoff within the Security Council where Western governments felt pretty convinced that Milosevic was up to no good and that Albanians needed some kind of reprieve, and that a peaceful settlement wouldn't come unless there was a change in the balance of power on the ground. Russia felt the opposite, wanted to stand by Serbia, and thus the Security Council was shut down. I mean, it was paralyzed. There was no hope of a peaceful solution that would advance the welfare of ethnic Albanians, at least that I saw. Maybe this is, again, will reflect my bias. But so too today, and I'd like to broaden it maybe beyond Kosovo, but the Security Council today is more clogged than it has been in its entire 63-year history, because now you have not only the Russia factor, which was a huge obstacle to any kind of legal independence arrangement. You have that factor, but then you have the China factor, where you have a country now that is making arguments about the irrelevance of human rights to international peace and security that Western governments used to make 20 or 30 years ago. Soon, if we finally get Al Gore's religion on the environment and start arguing, as we should, that global warming is a threat to peace and security, you'll see the Chinese government arguing within the Security Council that the Security Council should have no mandate to discuss the environment, that it has nothing to do with peace and security, that peace and security is about aggression and the invasion, of one country to another, that internal affairs are internal affairs. My point is that there's procedural legitimacy and then there's substantive legitimacy. I may have one view of substantive legitimacy, you may have another. The problem is the procedural legitimacy going forward on human rights, on sectarian issues, on proliferation even, on the environment. The procedural rules are going to lead to procedural paralysis within the United Nations. This is my worry. And the only way that changes is not by declaring it and saying, like John Bolton would, and say, Security Council can't achieve anything, screw it, let's just destroy the whole thing. But it's to say, you know what, the Council is, and the UN's paralysis more generally, the polarization within the UN, is a reflection of the polarization in the world. It's not like, there's not extra polarization at the UN, there's not extra clumsiness at the UN, there's not an extra deficiency or deficit in conscience. There's not extra nobility even, but it is a forum that gathers all of that in one place. And so while Simic is right that the unilateral declaration of independence is illegal, What he doesn't consider at all is that not sort of calling a spade and acknowledging what was the de facto situation on the ground for a very long time was going to bring about widespread violence. And just as the U.S. or the Western plan was not going to secure Russian support, no Russian plan was going to secure Western support. And we have these stalemates now that are very, very worrying. And one of the solutions that people like me talk a lot about is maybe moving away from the Council to regional organizations like NATO or the African Union or ASEAN or whatever. But the problem with that is that then you start to see really the balkanization of the international order into these regional organizations. So the only way long-term, and you talked about a long arc of history, and one hopes it bends toward justice. These days one isn't so sure. What has to change, and this is why I don't view this book as a book about the UN, I view it as a book about the kinds of problems we as a country have to start thinking about and have to tackle more responsibly. And similarly, China has to start thinking about, and Russia has to start thinking about. That is, the countries will have to change in order for the Council to be freed to do a better job balancing, for instance, the interests of Serbs and the interests of Albanians in that particular case, but more generally balancing stability and justice more broadly kind of across the globe.